and Mr. Smith。好，那各位同学呢，我们今天很荣幸哈，我们有来自美国2位嘉宾，我们的 Professor Anderson 然后在座呢，我们在座呢有我们英美系的老师邓老师，还有呢我们的俄文所那个尤教授尤老师。好，那我们现在呢，我们就把时间呢交给我们这一次的lecture 的主办就是我们的张雅兰教授张老师，那他会先做一个简单的介绍，来，张老师。
Okay, thank you, our chairperson, Professor Sun. Welcome everybody. I'm so glad you are be here with us. And we are very honored to have Professor Adamson to be here with us as well in Taidong, not only in Taidong but in our university. Okay. Well, actually, Professor Adamson is a prestigious scholar in the world, not just in the United States, and also in Taiwan. I've known her for, that's my privilege actually. I've known her for at least 1 decade, if not 2. Because I don't want to reveal my age, okay, so, yeah, but I want to say that back to my PhD student life, okay, she's always my role model, to push me to pursue in my career, especially my academic career, and then over time, she becomes my mentor, okay, in my life. Whenever I have encountered any difficulties in my life, she's always, stand by me and support me because I feel very grateful. Thank you. Yeah, and today we have, just as Professor Sun has already mentioned, we have several wonderful my colleagues to join with us, and also most of the audience are my students. Okay, so they have the background as English major and also the science fields, background. So maybe I expect that later during the QA session, we can have some interdisciplinary, feedback from you guys. Please seize the chance to ask the questions and to consult with Professor Adamson. That's a real chance, and that's the chance I always have, when I was a PhD student. Okay, so I hope you guys got this chance too. Before I go on to introduce Professor Adamson, I hope I can give a present to her because on behalf of the Dean of College, okay? Yeah, this is the special cup, and the most special part is we do have the poetic lines from one of the famous poets in Taiwan, that's Yu Guangzong. And regarding this, the poetry, he says, if we see this in terms of sunrise, Taidong is always in front of Taipei. So, we do have these walls on our campus. Later I can show you that part. And this is also the bags from our humanities. You can. Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay. We can have a. Thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, big hand, please.
Okay, so let me just make a brief introduction to Professor Jomi Adamson. Professor Jomi Adamson is a President Professor of Environmental Humanities at Arizona State University, where she also serves as a Distinguished Global Futures Scholar at the Julie Ann Riley Global Futures Laboratory. She is the founding director of the flagship hub of UNESCO's Bridges Sustainability Science Coalition, the first humanities-led science platform within UNESCO. Professor Adamson has been instrumental in shaping the field of environmental humanities with a focus on environmental justice, indigenous literatures, and sustainability. Her extensive work includes authoring and editing numerous influential publications that bridge the gap between humanities and environmental science. So today, Professor Anderson will share insights on integrating indigenous knowledge systems and storytelling into our understanding of environmental literature. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me, in welcoming Professor Anderson.
Thank you so much for that really warm introduction. And it has been my honor and privilege to be working with Professor Chan for over 20 years. I'll date myself. I'm okay with dating myself. And thank you so much, Chair Shen, for being here today and for inviting me to speak here at National Taekwondo University. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here. So today, let's see, I need to figure out how to advance this slide. Oh, maybe it's just this way, right? Yep. Okay, got it. Very simple. All right, so today what I want to do is talk about these two films. Day After Tomorrow. How many of you have seen Day After Tomorrow, where New York City gets frozen? Giant global superstorms come to the planet, and New York City and Tokyo get frozen. So let me see those hands again. Okay, very good number of people have seen Day After Tomorrow. That's excellent. And how many of you have seen Dune, a series of 3 films by Victor Villanueva? Wonderful. Okay, so we're going to be talking about these 2 films today. And what I want to do is use these 2 films to just reflect on my experience going to the Summit of the Future last September in New York City as a global delegate to the United Nations. And essentially we were thinking about the future of generations not yet born. So that would mean the future of your kids or your grandkids. Now, you don't know if you're going to have any kids, you don't know if you're going to have any grandkids, but essentially what we want everyone to think about on the planet, we want to start thinking about how are we going to ensure the future of generations not yet born. So as a humanities professor, what I want to do today is talk about these 2 films, reflect on the Global Summit of the Future, and think about the reason why climate fiction, which is these two films are climate fiction, fiction about a changing global superstructure of systems that essentially run our planet. And also why indigenous knowledge was at the center of what we were thinking about. Now, think about it. Climate fiction and indigenous knowledge, side by side at the Summit of the Future. We want to do a little bit of reflecting on why that is. So, in September of 2024, there I am at the United Nations. This is before everybody comes into the audience. I'm at the United Nations in the Summit of the Future. And the Summit of the Future hosted thousands, hundreds of thousands of global delegates. It was a monumental effort to forge a new international consciousness on how to safeguard the future of generations not yet born. So as the founder of Humanities for the Environment and UNESCO Bridges, the flagship hub of UNESCO Bridges, I was there officially as a delegate. And again, essentially what I did is I put together an event at the Summit of the Future where we juxtaposed climate fiction and indigenous knowledge with this toolbox of skills that include futures thinking. So I work at a global futures laboratory, and I'm going to give you a little bit of the background on where we even came up with this idea of a global futures laboratory in the context of the United Nations, and how we are integrating futures thinking, what futures thinking is, into this toolbox that we can use to ensure that future generations will survive. Future generations not yet born. So let me go back here. Futures thinking is touted as an anticipatory skill set. So how many of you know what the word anticipation means? I don't know if anybody would like to say what anticipation means, the word anticipation. What does that mean? Any volunteers? If you're anticipating something, what are you doing?
You're trying to predict the future.
Okay, we're going to think about that word predict. Okay, we're going to think about that word predict. That's a really good word in relationship to anticipation. So be thinking about things that you anticipate. What do you anticipate doing in 10 years? What do you predict you'll be doing in 10 years? So you are all anticipating your future already. Humans anticipate the future constantly. So what we want to do when we future think is we want to learn how to harness the skill of anticipation. So that, we're anticipating all the time, but do we know how to use it? Do we know how to take our anticipation and use it? So we're going to be using these two films, Day After Tomorrow and Dune, to think about how we harness our anticipation of the future. So let's go to the next slide. And so thinking about futures thinking, I want us to just sort of, there was a conference in 2012. It was called The Future We Want. 2012, a long time ago. 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, called The Future We Want. And at that conference, people, global delegates said, hey, we've been honing this skill of futures thinking for something like 30 years. Now we need to bring it onto the global stage, and we need to anticipate what's going to be happening by the year 2030 and what's going to be happening by the year 2050. So the United Nations came up with a set of 17 global challenges called the Sustainable Development Goals. And each of these Sustainable Development Goals needs to have a set of milestones in place if we're going to still be living on a habitable, flourishing planet by 2050 and then 2100. Okay? And actually, as a scientific community, how many of you are majoring in science? Raise your hand. If you're majoring in a STEM field or science, raise your hand. No science majors here today? Are you too shy? Who's majoring in some kind of science or minoring in some kind of science? Too shy? Okay, that's all right. We can come back to that. But we already know everything we need to do by 2030 and 2050 to ensure that our planet will be flourishing in 2050 and 2100. So we already know, we already have the knowledge, we know we can get there. Now we just need to convince everybody to go along with us, right? So I wrote this book called Humanities for the Environment, and it essentially traces the history of how the humanities have been side by side with the United Nations and the goal of creating a future we want, since 2012. So again, for all of these years, humanists have been very much involved in thinking about how we're going to create that planet we choose and we want, instead of just having an apocalypse happen to us. So if you think about Day After Tomorrow, and if you think about Dune, things happen to people they didn't anticipate, and that they didn't know it was going to happen. And so we're going to look at what happens when that happens in a film, and use it to sort of think about futures thinking. So in this lecture, I want to explore why climate fiction and indigenous storytelling were right there at the summit of the future. And we're going to use these two films to sort of think about that. And I'm really happy to know how many of you have already seen these two films, which is a great start to this lecture. But essentially, after these films came onto the global stage, this notion of climate fiction started being more and more popular. So have you guys noticed that a lot of science fiction is climate fiction? Ever since Day After Tomorrow, which just knocked the ball out of the park as far as, global audience, it was just immediately super popular. And afterwards, films featuring some sort of climate apocalypse or something that's going to happen to us as a result of climate change started being really popular. So one of the reasons why we were thinking about climate fiction at the Summit of the Future is because this is a really popular genre. People respond to this. People understand what's happening in a film. People understand why things are happening in a film. It's a form of narrative and storytelling. And probably if you are in the sciences and you're in the humanities, you probably already know that you have a superpower. Your superpower is storytelling. Storytelling is a superpower. And if you combine storytelling with data from science, knowledge from science, you absolutely have a superpower. So in both of these films, both directors are using science. They're building their fictional stories, their narratives on actual science about climate change. In this case, the Arctic. This is science about the Arctic, what's happening in the polar regions of the planet. This is Philip. Can you still hear me? Can you still hear me back in the back? I think he's gonna see what's going on, but I'm just gonna talk really loud now. Oh, wait. Let's see what's going on. Oh. All right, we're back in business. All right, and this one, Dune, is about what's going on in the desert. So Denis Villeneuve absolutely understands what is going on in the desert, and in fact, a lot of the scenes in the film are filmed in actual African desert scenes. So let's keep going. I'm going to juxtapose these two films with a novel by an indigenous woman, in this case, Linda Hogan, Chickasaw indigenous writer in the United States. And in 1994, she wrote a novel called Solar Storms. And your professor, Yalan Chen, has published on this novel, so she knows this novel very well, and I'm going to be talking about it today. And I'm going to be quoting her. I'm quoting some of the research she's done on this novel. Because indigenous knowledges were also central to the Summit of the Future, I wanted to juxtapose climate fiction with an indigenous novel. So I want to examine how understanding futures thinking can be enriched when we set climate fiction and indigenous knowledges side by side. Indigenous fiction tends not to be categorized as climate fiction. If it's written by an indigenous person, for some reason, eco-critics tend not to call it climate fiction. And indigenous fiction tends not to be set in the future. So Day After Tomorrow, set in the future. Dune is set in some sort of like science space, like futuristic place, not really the future, not really the past, but indigenous knowledges tend to be written in the present, like they're writing about what's going on now. And indigenous writers will tell you that the reason why they set their novels in the present is because for them, the apocalypse happened over 600 years ago. The apocalypse happened when colonization started. The apocalypse already happened. If you're indigenous, it already happened. Today, you are living in the apocalypse. You are dealing now with the apocalypse. So one of the reasons why indigenous knowledge keepers were at the Summit of the Future, and I included indigenous knowledge keepers on the event that I planned at the Summit of the Future, is because for 500 years they've been dealing with apocalyptic kinds of situations, and in fact, they're still here. They have survived. They are surviving. I just got back from Orchid Island. So we went over there to see essentially how the Dao are living in the present. We went to the underground houses of the Dao people to see why it was that, very smart, modern people tried to get them to move out of their underground houses. But in fact, those underground houses are very, very smart. A typhoon comes, it's very smart for you to be encased in stone, essentially, underground, and you're going to be safe there instead of, like, if you're living in a house with glass windows, those glass windows might get shattered, during a typhoon. So the Dao have actually lived a kind of science that they know, a kind of science that they know, and so they have knowledge that they've been passing down for 500 years. And so we wanted to put that knowledge that they've been passing down for 500 years right next to climate fiction, because we know a lot of things from science. We've learned a lot from science. Now let's put it right next to, side by side, with what we know from indigenous knowledges that in fact still works. It's still smart, and it still would help us run our planet. So I've decided to call this visionary fiction. So not climate fiction, but visionary fiction. And I'm going to link this notion of visionary fiction up with what I will call cosmovisions. So indigenous people around the world are networked. They are networked, and they call their indigenous oral traditions cosmovisions. And I will talk a little bit in a minute about why they call them cosmovisions. But what if we set side by side everything we know from Western science, which is a lot. We know a lot about climate fiction, we know a lot about what's happening on our planet, but what if we set it right next to indigenous knowledge? For example, the Dao underground houses, which are a very smart way to weather a monsoon. So I'm calling this visionary fiction because I'm taking this idea from indigenous fiction or science fiction. Some of the writers who are indigenous and have thought about the notion of a present-day novel, in fact, being like science fiction, because it is the apocalypse now, and people are showing you how they're surviving these conditions over hundreds of years. Sometimes those conditions were violent. Many times those conditions were extractive. Often those conditions including knocking down the Dao underground houses, for example. Every place indigenous people live, something usually violent or extractive has happened. So they're living in the apocalypse now, and these novels are a kind of indigenous futurism, argues Grace Dillon, indigenous writer, because they're showing us how to survive now. So other writers of color have also used this term, visionary fiction. And if any of you have read Octavia Butler's novels, have any of your students read Octavia Butler novels? Octavia Butler is a very famous African-American writer, and she wrote this novel called Parable of the Sower, and it's set in, she wrote it in the 80s, but it's set in 2022. And I just had my students read it last fall, because it was, I had them read it in 2022. They read it in the year that the novel was set. So it was written in the 80s, set in 2022, and in the novel, California is burning. Sound familiar? Have you been tracking those fires in California? Yeah. How did Octavia Butler know that? Because she understood ecology. She's a creative writer, but she understands science. And so she wrote a novel that scholars like Walida Imarisha, this is Walida Imarisha, have called visionary, because they in fact show us what's going to happen in the future. So did you use predict, anticipate? How did Octavia Butler African American writer, first African American science fiction writer, won all the awards, incredibly, well-known writer. How did she know that California would be burning in 2022? How did she know that? And then it happened. She passed away in the 1990s, but still, those of us that are reading her work, we say, this is visionary. Now I'm going to put this next side by side, this concept of visionary fiction with Solar Storms, to argue that indigenous writers with indigenous knowledges that have been passed down through thousands of years, they have predicting skills or anticipating skills. So what is anticipation? Future thinking is a way of harnessing our anticipation. Okay, let's get back to our other novels. The reason why I'm juxtaposing Solar Storms with Day After Tomorrow, because both of them are looking at patterns that help us predict or anticipate what is actually happening on the planet right now. So in the 1990s, scientists were beginning to say that anthropogenic activities, specifically dam building, massive dam building. You guys know that the Earth is 70% water, right? And you know that you're 70% water, right? You're 70% water. The Earth is 70% water. What if somebody went into your heart and built some massive dams, say, for example, in your aorta, your heart valve? That would be immediately a problem, right? Because you would be stopping your circulation. But as we look around the planet, we see these massive, ever-growing dam systems. And in that North Atlantic, scientists are saying that we have changed the pattern of circulation on our planet to such a large extent, to such a large scale, that we are in fact changing the circulation patterns. And there's this pattern in the North Atlantic called the thermohaline circulation. People call it AMOC. AMOC. Anybody studied the AMOC? Have any of you been studying ocean circulation patterns? Look at the way the Earth is connected. All of those patterns. And if any one thing changes, like for example, how much water is flowing out to the ocean or not, it changes more than we think. And so both Solar Storms and also Day After Tomorrow are both playing around in a fictional form with this idea that humans maybe should be more thoughtful about the way they interrupt systems or not. So, Day After Tomorrow and Dune are both what we call, in futures thinking, laboratories. This is a fictional laboratory. Both of these films are kind of like laboratories of the mind, because in this film, Day After Tomorrow, we can say, what would happen if, in fact, the AMOC collapsed, the thermohaline circulation system? What if it did collapse? What would happen? So, Roland Emmerich, the director of this film, he read some things about what would happen if the circulation